Hello, welcome back. We are now in the next lesson and we are going to talk about the First World War, usually called the Great War. And we are going to begin with a brief look at the map of Europe right before World War I. If you can look at this map, you'll see here is England, this is France, Italy, what used to be the Holy Roman Empire now has become two big major empires. One is this one, and this is the German Empire, and this one is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria-Hungary. So we have then this one, which is the German Empire, and this one, Austro-Hungary. And then this is what became the Soviet Union. In 1914 was still the Russian Empire, and Nicholas II was the Tsar of Russia. And this is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is also called the sick man of Europe because it has been very sick for the last couple of centuries and is still very sick, dying, but the Western Europeans have not let the Ottoman Empire die. And one of the reasons is because many of those countries are very interested in taking the land after the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is to look at this area. If we understand what is happening here, then it's very easy to understand what happened that triggered the First World War. And I want to remind you that when usually historians, when they deal with historical events, they look at what is called the 3 C's: causes, course, and consequences. And what we do in this class, we focus on the causes, we look at the consequences, but in general we do not fight wars. So we do not deal with the course of the war. There are other historians who like to focus on military history, but to me the causes and consequences are way more important than how many people were fighting, or how many airplanes they had, or how the weapons developed. So what I would like for you to focus on is this area, because this area used to be the Ottoman Empire, but by the last part of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is disintegrating, and many of these regions are getting independent. And one of these regions is Serbia. Serbia is playing a very important role in the events prior to the war, because Serbia is independent and Serbia is very interested in uniting with other regions here that will become independent to create what they call a greater Serbia. Now, the Serbs are Slavs, remember that, because the Serbs, being Slavs, are supported by the Russians, who are also Slavs. And this is going to be a very important issue that is going to contribute to the war. So as Serbia is trying to expand and create a greater Serbia, we have Austro-Hungary here, who is trying to also create a greater empire by taking some of the lands that the Ottoman Empire is going to lose. So what we see then is a conflict, a serious conflict between Serbia and Austro-Hungary. And Russia is going to be supporting Serbia. So you can see what's happening there. So I'm going to ask you to look at the details of what is called the Balkans. All this area is called the Balkans. The Balkans crisis, because there are several crises during this time. So look at the problems that happened during the last part of the 19th century, and then what happened prior to the beginning of the war. So having said that, let's analyze the general causes of World War I. So remember, anytime we analyze an event and we look at the causes, we have to realize that there is not one cause. Never, ever in history, there is one cause of one event. We always have to look at different causes, and all of those causes together are what make possible the event. So the first thing that we have to look at is the ideology of nationalism. And we keep going back to nationalism because after the middle of the 19th century, it seems that almost every conflict has had an element of nationalism. So how did nationalism play a part here? Well, each country believed that they were superior to any other. So that's the summary of it, but we'll look more in detail at those issues of nationalism. The other cause is what we discussed in previous lessons, and that is the new imperialism. Remember how each of those European countries is trying to get more and more and more colonies. And at some point, the fighting among them for those colonies is going to create a clash. But to me, perhaps it is even more important, or as important as the other two, militarism. Now, how do we define militarism? Well, one way to look at militarism is what percentage of the budget of each country is spent in military. Another way is to see the arms race. So how each country feels about making, creating, developing more and more and more weapons, and is increasing more and more the size of their armies. Well, all of this is happening at this time. They begin to have not voluntary armies, but they have conscription, and they are having more weapons, more soldiers, more militarism to promote peace. The more weapons we have, the more we are promoting peace. This is one of those ironic, absurd reasons that militaristic countries give to keep increasing their military. And then there is another aspect which also happened in Japan, and it has happened in almost every country. At some point, the political leaders give way to the military leaders. In other words, they allow either overtly or covertly military leaders to make decisions. And of course, those military leaders want war. They want to fight. So once they take control of a situation, they are not going to let it go. And that's what happened at the beginning, prior to the beginning of World War I. So these are, in general, the causes of the war. So when we analyze them, so remember, nationalism, the new imperialism, and militarism. And each one of them, of course, has different aspects of it. We have then specifically a short-term cause. What is actually happening right before the war began? For different reasons that I'm also going to ask you to look into, there were specific alliances that were being formed. Sometimes the alliances broke and one country broke the alliance with the others and changed sides. But right before the beginning of the war, there were two clear sides. And what happens when you have what we call the gang mentality? Well, you feel stronger because you have people or countries to back you up. And so what you would not do if you were alone, then you do when you know that you can count with the others. So these two alliances are very important to understand also why the countries behaved the way they did. But then, of course, there has to be something that triggers it. And in this case, it was an assassination. And the person who was assassinated was the heir to the empire. Which empire? The Empire of Austria-Hungary. And unfortunately, the assassin, or assassins, because it was a group that conspired to kill him, were from Serbia. We are not saying that the Serbian government planned it. It was a terrorist group from Serbia. But because of the conflict that already existed between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, this is what triggered the beginning of the conflict. So look in the book and in your other documents and videos how this escalated. It's very interesting to analyze who is actually responsible for the war, who started it, who made the specific mobilization or action that triggered the war. The war begins. As I said, we are not fighting the war, we are not looking at the details, but it is important to look at something that started full blast during this time, and that is propaganda. We know, when we think about it, that propaganda works. If you hear something over and over and over, even if it is not true, you end up believing it. And so we know that that happens. And in this situation, in this historical event of the Great War, propaganda played a very important role. For instance, and we, even though you have not lived long enough to remember, we in the last 15 years, we have been object of propaganda. What we have been hearing from the government over and over and over. Every time we go to war, our cause is just. So we are justified for going to war. And we receive from the government all the reasons why the war is just. And we believe it. The majority of people believe it. And the small minority who doesn't believe it is seen as anti-patriot, whatever that country is. There is another way propaganda works. Let's imagine that the country is very divided over ideology, over whatever. If there is a war, then the country unites behind the leaders. So war serves as pacifier. So propaganda serves the leaders to pacify the country. Let's forget about domestic policies. Let's forget about financial problems. We forget about everything because we have a common enemy. Propaganda is going to contribute to do that. In the case of World War I, right before, at the end of the 19th century, there were many ideologies, and some of the ideologies were fighting with each other. Socialism was very strong, liberalism was very strong, nationalism was very strong. Prior to the war, when the propaganda machine started, the propaganda machine contributed to nationalism in such a way that socialism went to the background. The ex-socialists now are ready to fight for their country. So nationalism has defeated socialism. Nationalism contributed also to the belief that we have all the capability of winning because militarily we are superior, and propaganda did that. The government propaganda was bombarding each individual people, saying we are going to win, the war is going to be very short because we have all what we need to win. And we also know that propaganda helps to make us believe that we, not only we are good, we are superior. And if we are good, the enemy is bad. And the government is going to try to use propaganda to show how evil the enemy is. And if that propaganda helps convincing the people of the country that the enemy is evil, then the people of the country are going to support fully the war effort because we are fighting evil. So remember that because propaganda is going to play during the war a very important role. And then of course propaganda is also going to stay with us. So from World War I to today, propaganda is the key for anything that governments want. The only thing that I would like to focus on when we discuss the course of the war is the Western Front, and specifically what your book calls the Great Slaughter. Read about the trench warfare, how absurd it was. Look at how senseless it was to keep those soldiers dying and dying and dying without advancing, and analyze how those military leaders refused to look at what was happening. There are some battles that are a good example of the senselessness of the war. One was the Battle of the Somme, and the other one was the Battle of Verdun. Verdun, let me show you. This is Verdun. It is so absurd to think that they spent 10 months Look at how many people died. 700,000 people died. The population of the little village of Verdun was devastated. Well, the village disappeared practically. From about 15,000 people, we had only 3,000 left, and they did not advance. The result of the battle was just the devastation. It was during this time also, during the period of trench war, that poison gas was used. This is like the beginning of something really horrible. And the result was that people died without any sense. I was with my family at Verdun, at the site, and there is a place, there is a monument there that you have windows, and when you look through the window, all you see is body pieces. Just arms, heads, knees, all kinds of body pieces there, because those are the people who died and who were never identified. And when you turn back, you look at all those thousands and thousands of crosses of people who were actually identified. It is really sad to look at that. An entire generation of young men disappeared because of that, and the military leaders refused to stop that. That was the worst part of that. So once we talk about, there are many other, if you are interested in military history, the Great War has very interesting new things that happened. But what I would like is to focus a little on the United States and how the United States began to be part of this. Most historians today believe that the reason why the United States entered the war was economic, because the United States had already lent a great deal of money to England. And at some point it was very important for the United States to be sure that England was going to win the war. But at some point it was not even sure which side the United States would join, because there was no clear reason to join one side or the other. But again, propaganda worked. British propaganda in the United States was fantastic, was very well done, and eventually the majority of the people of the United States agreed that the United States should enter the war. But there was a need there needed to be an event that would convince people. Now, people knew, for instance, that the Germans had started again submarine warfare, and that was considered a no-no at the time. And they had stopped for a while, and then they had restarted the submarine warfare. But then something very good happened, good for the war cause, and that was the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania actually was carrying weapons, so it was not just a passenger cruise ship, but it didn't matter because American people died, and when American passengers died, then it was a very good reason to enter the war, and that's how the United States entered the war. There are other reasons. There is something that, if you want to look at, it's also interesting, the famous Zimmermann telegram. You can look at it, and for some time they believed that Zimmermann telegram had been an invention, that it never happened. But then, even recently, some people met the grandson of Zimmermann, and he confirmed that the telegram had actually existed. And that's another possible cause of the United States entering the war. And once the United States entered the war, again, I would like for you to look at how fascinating President Wilson used, again, propaganda. And not only propaganda, it was an entire machinery of activities that made the people of the United States agree with the war. President Wilson, even though he himself was supposed to be pacifist, and at the end of the war he was very idealistic, but he decided that if he was going to be part of that war, he wanted the people of the United States to agree. So he created the Committee on Public Information. If you are interested, look at it because it is fascinating, all what that committee did. Look at this act and the Sedition Act. Basically, you were not allowed to be against the war. Dissent was totally forbidden. And even this, what you see here, is fascinating because President Wilson appealed to university professors, to writers, to artists, all kinds of Hollywood filmmakers to help with the war effort, and it worked. Not many people knew why they supported the war effort, but they did. So it was a very well planned and well implemented campaign of public opinion. So if you're interested in public relations and propaganda, that would be something that you would like to look into. And that's basically the only thing I'm going to give you as introduction to the causes and course of the war. And now the last part of this introduction is going to be the peace settlement and what happened. There is a detailed PowerPoint presentation in your lesson content. If you are interested in looking at every one of those peace treaties, you may, you don't have to. What you have in the study questions is enough if you want to just pass the exam, pass the quizzes. But if you are interested in how it happened, you have the information there. These are the three main actors. Georges Clemenceau is the Prime Minister of France, and then we have, of course, President Wilson, and we have Lloyd George. And these three are the ones who made the decision. As you look at the role of President Wilson, you'll see that he was the most idealistic of all. Perhaps because the United States had not been invaded or attacked, and the United States had not lost as many people as the others. But both Clemenceau and Lloyd George wanted very much revenge. They both were angry. They wanted Germany and Austria, especially Germany, to pay, and what they wanted to do was to punish Germany. President Wilson was the opposite. President Wilson was hoping that this war would result in fair and just treatment for all. It didn't work. So the result of the war was what Clemenceau and Lloyd George wanted. Germany was very harshly punished. This is the way Germany and Austria-Hungary looked like before the war. And after the war, their territory was decimated, and many countries were created out of what had been these two empires. Both the Empire of Germany and the Empire of Austria-Hungary disappeared. New governments were formed, and the sad thing about it was that when they remapped all this area, they did not take into consideration the people who live there. They created artificial boundaries, and those artificial boundaries were partly the reason for what happened later, which was another war. These new countries were so artificially formed that, for instance, Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore, because the people who live there did not agree with this creation of a country. But the other area that was remapped, and we'll talk about it more in detail later, was what had been part of the Ottoman Empire, this section here. And again, these three, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and President Wilson, made decisions, especially France and England, made decisions that created a great deal of resentment from the people who lived in the Middle East. They basically divided the Middle East among themselves. Part of it was taken by France, and part of it was taken by England, and they gave a name that was mandate. So as a mandate from the League of Nations, that's how they called it. But in reality, they were taking over the land, and the people who lived there did not like it. And so that was another reason why the situation after the war was so tense. So there were 20 years of peace after these peace treaties happened. And now let's look at the results, some of the results of this great war. The most tragic one is the millions of people who died because of that. And not only soldiers, although too many soldiers died also, but the people, everyday people died as a result of this senseless, literally senseless war. All those hopes that people in each country had at the beginning resulted in total hopelessness, disillusion, and they realized that they could not trust their leaders, that their leaders had made decisions that were not logical, and just because of pride and because of stubbornness. So they were very angry at their leaders, especially because during the war, civil liberties had been attacked with the pretext and the excuse that they needed to fight together. Then their civil liberties had been constantly under attack, and that was something that many people resented. And that remapping of the world that we talked about before was also something that all throughout the world created tremendous resentment, especially from the Arab countries, the people who lived in the Middle East. President Wilson kept talking about self-determination. That was one of his phrases, self-determination. And certainly there was absolutely no self-determination for any, either European or in the Middle East. So what had been the Ottoman Empire, all those people were really angry at the result of the war. More results. Immediately, right after the peace settlement, we could see what was happening. First of all, even among the winners, governments grew larger and stronger, because governments were used to telling people what to do during the war. So all the distribution of all the goods, all the weapon building, all that had been a government effort. So the governments kept very strong after the war. And in some places, we see the development of strong dictatorships. And that's the topic for our next lesson. The totalitarian dictatorships that developed as a result of this great war. Then we have something very interesting that happened. As a result of World War I, the European civilization lost power. So up until that moment, the Europeans are in control of the world. After World War I, it is so devastated, the land of Western Europe, that now we see other countries beginning to take power. And we see the newly formed Soviet Union, we see the United States, and we see the emergence of Japan also. So these three countries that are not European, Russia is Eurasian, have become more powerful as a result of the war. And after we discuss these three totalitarian dictatorships in Italy, Germany, and Russia, the Soviet Union, then in the following lesson we are going to discuss the final result of the Great War, and that is World War II. And with this we end the introduction to the lesson. And remember, focus on the problem of the Balkans. Focus on, when you deal with the course of the war, be sure and focus on the Western Front and the Battle of Verdun, and then analyze carefully the peace settlement. Remember, if you have questions, I am only one email away, or the discussions board can also be a very effective tool for any questions. So I will see you then when we discuss the next lesson.